Welcome to our viewers of EJIL Live. And I have with me Bernie Hoekman, who is a professor at the European University Institute here in Florence and also a professor at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. And together with Petros Mavroidis, they are publishing in the recent issue of EJIL an article entitled WTO à la carte, or Menu de jour, assessing the case for more plurilateral agreements. Now, in a way, Bernie, it's back to the future, because I remember that during the Uruguay round, one of the big objectives was the single undertaking. In other words, to get rid of the then existing plurilateral agreements and to try and have a uniform, horizontal, multilateral, comprehensive regime. And now, 20 years later, almost to the date, you and Petros are coming forward and suggesting that maybe that single undertaking project has to be relooked at again, and there may be advantages in facilitating a reintroduction of plurilateral agreements. For those who are not familiar with the terminology, a plurilateral agreement would be an agreement within the auspices of the WTO with the various mechanisms, institutional arrangements, so an integral part of the WTO, but nonetheless an agreement in which a group of member states would take upon commitments which are not necessarily shared by the entire membership. And one reason we decided to dedicate this EJIL Live to this topic, because it's of interest also in other international organizations. There's a lot of talk in the European Union of two-speed, géométrie variable. There are even provisions of the treaty. So it's a live topic also beyond the WTO. So briefly, what's the case for reintroducing today plurilateral agreements?
Well, I think it's not so much reintroducing in the sense that this is a provision and that it was always kind of embedded in the WTO when it was designed. And so you mentioned we've kind of shifted from a multilateral trading system that used to be à la carte under the GATT. So the GATT was very difficult to amend. So when countries wanted to move forward in particular areas, they signed distinct agreements which countries could sign on to. In the Uruguay round, a lot of that, as you mentioned, disappeared because in the creation of the WTO, a lot of the negotiators, especially from the industrialized countries, were strongly of the view that they wanted to have one system where the rules would apply to everyone, and where developing countries, if they had difficulty implementing particular provisions, would have more time or would get assistance to implement. But the idea was to have common rules. I think that's still a model to be pursued in the sense that we want to have rules that apply multilaterally as much as possible. But at the same time, it's also become clear, both through the context of the Doha round negotiations, which have been ongoing for a long time, that it's very difficult to get agreement among 161 countries. So that's one stylized fact. The other stylized fact is that countries are negotiating preferential trade agreements left, right, and center, and have been doing that more intensively over time. So one of the ironic features of the WTO period is that the WTO gets created in 1995, and almost from the get-go we have a little bit of a lull in the first 2 years where countries are focusing on the WTO as an institution, but then they go off and negotiate more and more plurilateral agreements, trade agreements that are preferential in nature. So they're not under the WTO, the WTO obviously makes allowance for free trade agreements, customs unions, and agreements to cover preferential liberalization of trade and services, but a lot of the action, especially when it comes to new rules, are being negotiated in these preferential trade agreements. So what we're arguing in the paper is that the original vision of having a single undertaking and essentially one size fits all, we have common rules that apply to all countries, is something that increasingly is kind of demonstrated by experience to be very difficult to achieve. So you see it both in terms of the negotiations, but you also see it in the revealed preference of countries to negotiate amongst themselves new disciplines that would only apply to them. So I think we really have a choice. We can either say we should try and pursue the WTO approach where everything applies to everyone, Or we have to recognize reality, and that in a sense is what Petros and I are arguing in the paper, and say what we really should be thinking about is making a comparison between a world which we have more and more preferential trade agreements where there's a lot of discrimination embedded in that, or a world where we try and bring some of the issues that are being negotiated on the preferential trade agreement front, bring those into the WTO and put them under the umbrella of the WTO, which we argue would have a number of advantages in terms of transparency, in terms of ensuring that countries that eventually want to join can join, and so forth. So we can come back to those kind of the comparison between preferential trade agreements and.
Could you give me and the viewers one example? What would be your #1 candidate for a plurilateral agreement to be negotiated now within the framework of the WTO?
Obviously, that's sorry. That's going to be a function of my own idiosyncratic views of things. I think the nice dimension of the plurilateral agreement track is countries can decide to do whatever they want to do in terms of choosing topics. Now, if we think about potential subject areas, think about the trade facilitation. So trade facilitation is the one area where there actually has been a new agreement negotiated under the WTO. They've created a trade facilitation agreement, which is now in the context of being ratified and implemented. But that trade facilitation agreement focuses very much on customs-related matters. Right? So it's about border clearance, it's about cooperation in customs issues, one-stop border shops, and so forth. It's very much customs. So that's where the action is, and it's very important. And there's been a lot of research done that suggests that that actually is going to generate a lot of benefits for countries to implement. But if you talk to the private sector and you ask them, okay, so what are some of the key constraints that increase the costs for you of getting goods into a country? They'll talk about customs, but they will also talk about logistics, they'll talk about distribution services, they'll talk about product standards, they'll talk about a whole bunch of other policy areas that impact on the ability and the cost and the efficiency of them getting goods to their warehouse or to the retail distribution centers. So you could think about a plurilateral agreement to say, okay, there are a number of countries that are willing to go further than just purely customs-related trade facilitation and say, let's actually think about it, for example, in the context of a supply chain. Right? So insofar as we need to kind of focus on what are some of the policy measures that affect business the most, well, let's create then the context where we discuss that in a plurilateral setting. And if we can identify areas where we want to go further, where we think it'll help, it will lower the costs of getting goods.
Give me an example of 1 or 2 rules that might be included there.
It could be a rule saying we should have competitive road trucking industry. So you could have a competition policy dimension of an agreement where we say all of us agree to ensure that we abide by certain principles with respect to being able to enter into the trucking industry. So if you think about what actually raises cost in African countries, for example, there's been quite a bit of research showing that a number of countries, it's really the trucking industry or the transportation sector more generally, which is non-competitive, where there are large barriers to entry, and that's the reason that costs are high in some of these markets. So it's a way of bringing in areas, policy areas, which are not subject to WTO rules at the moment.
So I don't take a position. I'm agnostic in the sense that I found your paper very interesting and thought-provoking, but not exactly being the devil's advocate, but I want to raise some question that I think some of our readers would ask. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this, isn't there a risk that one of the advantages of the single undertaking that in some way it equates bargaining power between the rich industrialized and the rest, and that you would be able to, you would see again more arm twisting between the big consuming countries against smaller countries who are interested in the trade, but they lose bargaining power, which they had when it's a single undertaking, when they have biggies to help them. So that could be one objective, that it would be reintroduction of the sort of unequal bargaining power, which painfully, but after Uruguay, developing countries learned to use. And let's take this one first.
No, and I think that's certainly one of the reasons, and certainly if you read both the literature or if you talk to negotiators in Geneva about kind of the ideas of doing more on the plurilateral track, that's certainly one of the big arguments you're going to get and run into. And one of the reasons why the developing countries in particular, because they tend to be small and not have much in the way of market power, are very much in favor of the single undertaking is it gives them leverage. Right, so that's unambiguously true, and I agree with that. And I think that is one of the big advantages of designing a negotiating agenda of the type that we have, that we were supposed to have in Doha, where you could make these trade-offs and make these linkages. If you think about what can be done in the plurilateral context, however, a lot of that is not going to relate to market access issues of the type where you have this linkage. It's very much, I think, and as an aside, we're not arguing that plurilateral agreements are the be-all, end-all. We're really arguing for, on the margin, doing more under that track in the WTO. And I think in particular where there is an advantage to using or considering using these agreements, which actually deals with your issue, and I think the issue that concerns a lot of people in Geneva, is to focus those on areas where there isn't much in the way of scope for these types of linkages. So essentially you could think about initially pursuing the plurilateral track in areas where essentially it's about domestic policy, which would help countries improve their economic governance locally, which would also help other traders in the rest of the world, but it's not something that another country is going to pay a lot for. So in terms of the linkage dimension, it might not be all that productive.
But there's a different type of, if you could say, indirect linkage, because obviously there's pressure, and the way the WTO often works is that the private sector interested in increasing trade for good reason, so there's no cynicism in what I'm saying, increasing profit, etc., wants to make transactions more efficient. They put pressure on their governments who bring it to the negotiating table of the WTO. And there might be countries who are not opposed, but they want movement in other areas. I mean, the classic Doha, it's a complicated story, and I'm hopelessly simplifying it, but since neither the United States nor the European Union were really willing to make sufficient or significant or sufficiently magnanimous concessions on agriculture, it was it's either all or nothing in order to have leverage, and maybe we need a lot of patience. Although Uruguay took a very, very long time. We tend to regret it. And there's a moral hazard that the pressure to reach the kind of big deal will be removed because you have a lot of these small deals with, in addition with the danger of much reduced or unequal bargaining power. So the moral hazard is that the pressure is taken off to make the big concessions that would unblock a Doha type major settlement.
So that really depends a lot on what is the value of the issue on the table in terms of linkage. Right? So the European Union was pushing for competition policy, investment policy at the beginning of the Doha round, transparency in government procurement, which I think are all important topics. But if at the end of the day you were to ask how much was the Union willing to pay in quotes, for those issues, it wasn't a whole lot. Right? So I think it does come back to this issue of what issues are we talking about. I think the other point to bear in mind is, again, from the linkage perspective, a lot of these things are already being taken off the table through the preferential trade agreements. So what we're seeing is, and if you talk to, I've talked to a European negotiator a while ago who essentially was arguing, at the end of the day, we're covering so much of our trade as Europeans with the rest of the world through these preferential trade agreements that increasingly what we can get in the WTO is really not worth it. Right? So I think this is a big issue, but that issue is already kind of materialized through this vehicle of preferential trade agreements.
But if that is the rationale, and I'm not disputing it, but if that is the rationale, then the proposal that you and Petros are coming forward with, it could be said, okay, we raise the white flag, the big issues are now being dealt with outside through the real avalanche of preferential trade agreements. So let's just go for the pennies because the pounds have already been spelt elsewhere. So it's a kind of admission that we have to give up our big ambitions for further development of the WTO and just be working on the margin, and these can be some kind of marginal improvements. So do you agree with me? Would you protest that there's something of a raising of the white flag here?
No, I don't think it's the raising of the white flag, because again, going back to the whole issue of linkage and getting to yes on the big issues, that inherently is going to have to involve the big countries agreeing on a set of trade-offs. And I think it's not correct to characterize the reasons for the failure of the Doha round concluding. It has not to do with small countries holding up a deal. I mean, what we really are confronting is we have the big countries, the US, the EU as a bloc, and China in particular. Those three have to get to yes. And I think if we're realistic...
And India and Brazil, I would say.
India, Brazil, but again, I think if you have those three pushing, then I think certainly Brazil will go along. India, is always going to be more pushing its own agenda. But I think what I'm saying is essentially it's the big countries that will define whether or not something will go ahead. So I think where I agree with you, but I wouldn't characterize it as waving the white flag, is there are a number of areas that are being pursued now in the context of preferential trade agreements that could very well and very reasonably be pursued in the WTO, which are not going to increase world growth by 2 percentage points a year, but which over time will help improve the rules of the game that are embedded in the WTO. So.
What are the politics of this? If we imagine a sort of ministerial meeting and this is on the agenda, let's give a green light to plurilateral agreements, put forward an agenda of plurilateral agreements, how are the politics going to play out? Are there going to be countries who in principle are going to say no, or is it just going to be on an issue by issue, but basically there won't be big principled opposition to this suggestion? What are the politics here?
Well, I think it's very difficult to have principled opposition until you know what's actually on the table. So nobody can stop a bunch of countries from actually saying, okay, let's talk about issue X in the context of potentially going to the WTO membership as a whole and asking for approval to include a new plurilateral agreement. So I think the politics are very much on, can we identify other countries that are willing to think WTO as opposed to preferential trade agreements? And I think for me that really is the big question as to whether there's an appetite to actually use the multilateral trading system in the way that the system was designed to allow it to be used, because the plurilateral agreement idea is embedded in the system. It's there. It can be used. So I think one of the questions you can ask, and which we don't really ask in the paper, but I think it's an important question, is, okay, so why is everybody going preferential trade agreement as opposed to plurilateral agreement? And we discussed that a bit in the paper. And one of our hypotheses is that it's actually too difficult to actually adopt new plurilateral agreements in the WTO because there's an explicit consensus requirement. So any country that wants to be difficult can just say, no, I don't accept.
Because even though it's a plurilateral agreement, to the actual introduction of a plurilateral agreement within the WTO, you would need consensus of the whole membership, even those who are not part of the plurilateral agreement.
So that's the current rule within the WTO.
But to change that rule, you'd also need consensus.
Indeed, indeed. So one of the things we argue in the paper, that we should at least start a discussion in the WTO to kind of clarify both where there are substantive principled concerns with respect to more plurilateral agreements, but also to try and agree, again, and this would require consensus, on can we at least for certain types of plurilateral agreements make it easier for countries to move forward so that we create an incentive for those countries to start doing more things in Geneva as opposed to doing them bilaterally or regionally in the context of preferential trade agreements.
Can I ask you, it's tangential, but it's also very germane to the whole posture of your paper. Am I right in detecting a certain dissatisfaction with the development of so many regional and bilateral trade agreements? I thought the view had changed on that whereas in the past, and also in the heyday of the single undertaking, in the mid-90s, etc., one dealt with these regional and bilateral trade agreements as a necessary evil, but the world would be a better place without them. And I think the mood has changed, and there's come to an understanding that maybe it's not a bad system to have the two regimes working side by side. Where do you and Petra stand on that? Is it really harmful to have these? After all, the overall, for example, if we look at duties, is so low that the preferentiality, at least when it comes to custom duties of these agreements, is pretty marginal, because you're reducing tariffs from 3 or 4 or 5% over 90% of products to 0. It's not a huge difference in most sectors. So are you unhappy with this, the plethora of preferential agreements, or is it just more principled stand?
Well, I think, well, from a principle point of view, I think we have way too many of them. And, you know, Jagdish Bhagwati has talked about the spaghetti bowl, we have the noodle bowl, etc. And I think that is an issue. So if you talk to firms...
I used to do, for many years, I used to do rules of origin. I can tell you there were a lot of billable hours involved in all this plethora of trade agreements. Rules of origins is a mess, I must admit that it does complicate things.
So there are definitely transactions costs associated with this proliferation of preferential agreements. Tariffs are relatively low, but again, there's been quite a bit of research recently focusing on the effects of tariffs if you're in a supply chain world, where even relatively low tariffs, every time you cross the border, they tend to accumulate. So I think between the rules of origin, between these administrative costs associated with differences, I personally am of the view that it would be much better to actually do more of this multilaterally when it comes to kind of traditional market access. I think where there is clearly, and this goes back to the theme of the paper, I think if we're talking about regulatory types of policies, what are called behind the border types of policies, it's very difficult to kind of move forward on those with 161 countries all on board. Right? So I think there, if you look at what is actually happening in a lot of the more recent vintage preferential trade agreements, a lot of that really is all about facilitating trade in services. It's about regulatory cooperation, trying to move towards kind of adoption of common principles with respect to regulation, and so forth. So that, I think, makes a lot of sense, and we recognize that in the paper, but we then also argue that, you know, why not do that in Geneva? You don't need to do that bilaterally, etc. So that's, I think, one. I think the other side of the equation with respect to people becoming kind of more relaxed about preferential trade agreements is the empirical work in the economics field, I think, shows now pretty compellingly that once you move down this track, the political economy is such that you actually liberalize on a non-discriminatory basis as well. So I think that's one of the reasons why certainly the economists are a lot more relaxed, I think, on average than they were 10, 15 years ago, simply because of the empirics, right? So we actually have seen a more general reduction.
Right, when the special interest is hit by 0 tariffs within a regional preferential agreement, they lose their stomach to fight it globally. So,
but we do see the traditional types of things that economists have traditionally been worried about with respect to trade diversion. We've seen that play out in the TPP episodes over the last couple of months, where we say Mexico being difficult because we want to safeguard our preferential access to the North American market. So those types of incentives.
That is very insidious.
Yeah.
When it prevents a broader agreement because you want to keep your preferential advantage within a narrower trade. Yeah. But if I look at it not as an economist, but as a politologist, one of the advantages I see, I've been studying ASEAN for the last 3 or 4 years in a major project which is now coming out. We have online, we have on stream about 20 books looking at all aspects of ASEAN. And one of the advantages that I think the regional agreement gives, it's not measured in pure economic terms. I think the big advantage, the big gain of ASEAN for the 10 member states of ASEAN is more political than economic. It's countries which harbored hostilities, which didn't have a culture of talking to each other. And now, because of those structures, even if the economic gains are limited or sometimes marginal, But there's a huge advantage in terms of the politics of the region, the inter-regional politics, etc. And I'm not sure that would be captured if it was a plurilateral agreement, because by definition it would be open to all. Yep. So there might be a loss there, because very often the incentives for these regional agreements is not strictly economic, but it's a kind of political act.
Yep. And we recognize that in the paper. So we say,
I saw that.
One of the reasons we have Article 24, in the GATT was exactly to allow that type of integration to proceed. And that's certainly not something you're going to get through plurilateral agreements. And I think the other example in the ASEAN experience is very interesting, is that it allows you to go again beyond a lot of the issue areas that are covered now in the WTO. So for example, they have, as I'm sure they have kind of made progress on visa regimes, for example, right? So if one country issues a visa, then that means that you can use that visa to get into another ASEAN country. It's those types of issues that are increasingly on the table in the preferential context, where I think we really need to move it's more difficult to move multilaterally, but I think those are the types of initiatives where if you can broaden that out, that would help.
One of the things we've learned in the ASEAN project, it's a simple thing, but it was a blinding insight, that when we moved into it, our premise was that rule-based is better than non-rule-based, and some measure of constitutionalism is the gold standard for successful regional integration. And we see, for example, that there's so many things the EU wants to do and can't do because the constitutional lawyers tell them that's beyond the competences, you're not allowed to do it. And in ASEAN, you have none of that. Whatever they want to do, they can sit down and do it. They want to talk about security, military, defense, they can do it within the framework of ASEAN without the lawyers breathing down their neck, etc. So it makes one rethink some of the supposedly hard truths of regional integration generally, where the European Union used to be the sort of, well, nobody's going to be quite like that, but the closer you get, the better your marketplace will be. There's some downsides to that. I suppose at the end of the day, one can be Catholic about it. In other words, take the relaxed attitude to bilateral and regional trade agreements, but not at the exclusion of plurilateral. When it works, why not have both of them? We have to come to an end, so maybe a last word would be in predictive mode. If we fast forwarded, say, 5 to 10 years from now, do you expect we would see a return to pre-95 with some important plurilateral agreements as part of the WTO regime?
I don't think we'll ever see a rollback to that situation. I think I would like to see at least a couple of efforts having been made to move forward in this arena, especially on the regulatory front, where I think there actually is a lot already happening which you could call plurilateral, except it's outside the WTO. And I think one of the interesting areas also for research, looking forward, and I guess a large part of our audience is academic, it's really to ask the question, where does a trade agreement actually help in terms of promoting regulatory cooperation? So I think that's an area where, again, from the perspective of experimenting, of trying to identify where you could actually use a WTO type of mechanism to help promote regulatory convergence cooperation. So that's what I would like to see, at least a couple of efforts by countries to do that, as opposed to the current status quo, which is very much, we're not even going to try. That said, I don't think we're going to see dozens of plurilateral agreements being negotiated in the next 10, 15 years. I just don't see that happening.
Did I detect the little sort of hint, let's get on with TTIP and TTIP?
I would definitely like to see TTIP move forward. I think the TPP is a lot less kind of innovative with respect to a lot of these regulatory types of issues. So therefore, I think the US-EU situation is by far the most interesting one, because there you have two countries with very well-developed regulatory regimes with very low tariffs. So they really, if the EU and the US can actually make progress.
I can expect some of our viewers at this point are bursting a blood vessel, so let's on this, in order to safeguard world health, let's keep off that topic. And I want to thank you, and also through you, Petros for what I think is a very remarkable article in this issue of EJIL, and I invite all of you to take a look. You will be rewarded. It's thoughtful, it looks at both sides of the issues, it raises the cons and the pros, and at a minimum it's food for thought. Thank you very much, Bernie Hoekman.
No, thank you.